Well, hello everybody, this is David Bianco. Welcome back to the channel. And if it's your first time, thank you for hopping on board. So today it's another vinyl shootout of one of the Atlantic 75th series releases. Those 75 LPs that are coming out over a time period from Analogue Productions. Now these are special because they are cut at 45 RPM and they are on 2 LPs. This time it's another Bad Company release, but it's their second release called Straight Shooter. We're going to see how that compares to a US original LP as we take our next Safe and Sound Texas audio excursion. Well, pretty much so far, these releases coming from Analogue Productions on 2 LPs at 45 RPM from this Atlantic 75th Anniversary series have been pretty darn stellar. As a matter of fact, there are a few that really corrected some issues with previous releases. And you can see some of those reviews back in my video list and my playlist for Analogue Productions. But this one is one that came out in 1975, which is a special year to me because I graduated from high school that year. Now, Bad Company had a really large success with their self-titled original album that came out in May of 1974. And that LP hit #1 in the US and #3 in the UK. Now, as we all know, there can be what's called the sophomore jinx, where the second record that you release can be a real stinker. And there's plenty of bands that have gone through that. So one of the things about this record that was interesting is that about 4 months in September of '74, after the release of the self-titled, Bad Company and Ron Nevison, who did the recording and the mixing, went back in and worked on this to record it to kind of try to catch fire because they were hot, their singles were hot, and the mojo was really working at that time. The band and Ron Nevison, who did the recording and the mixing for this album, set up at Ronnie Lane's mobile studio at Clearwell Castle at Gloucestershire, England. And they were in a position to get these 8 songs done and ready to get them released. Now, the original recording was done there, but it took a while to get the mixing done. So that is one of the reasons there was a delay for this to be released in '75. The other issue was some of the songs on the first album were still really hot in FM radio, and they were kind of riding that out as sales were still pretty strong into 1975 off of the self-titled. But they were locked and loaded and ready to be able to release this album, which is exactly what they wanted to do. So did this sophomore jinx come to pass for this album? Well, not really as it related to the album sales. This record was ranked up to #3 in the UK, which tied the self-titled, but it only reached #3 in the US, which was a couple slots below its #1 start for their self-titled, but still a really strong showing for a second LP. Now, on the single release 45 side, which was a big thing back in the day, the first one pulled was Good Lovin' Gone Bad, and unfortunately that one only made it to #36 in the US charts, which was rather disappointing. But in June of '75, when they released the second single, Feel Like Making Love, it did eke into the top 10 at #10. And as I said, I graduated from high school at that time, so that was a big song right around graduation time. I remember graduation weekend, Chicago, the band Chicago and the Beach Boys were touring together, and they played at Chicago Stadium 5 or 6 nights in a row, and we saw them one of the nights, and it was a fantastic show because the Beach Boys had been doing some work with Chicago and backing vocals at Caribou Ranch a couple of years before the unfortunate shooting of Terry Kath, self-inflicted and unplanned, but there was a lot of work being done there. So that was a very fertile time for music. It really brings back a lot of memories to me, and this album was part of that. So I picked up a pressing of this back when it was released, and I got the version which was actually from the closest record plant to where I lived, which was Precision PRC in Richmond, Indiana, just east of Indianapolis. And I think regionally, a lot of the records that I got were from PRC because probably the distribution channels were local and around that plant, and that's why I think us in the Midwest mainly got PRC pressings. They were decent. They weren't quite as good as, let's say, Columbia Santa Maria, for example, but they were decent, and definitely we saw that these are ones that were done by George Marino at Sterling, which tells you the quality of the actual mastering that was done. The stamps on there, the TML-M, which is for their master cutter, and TML/S, which is for their secondary cutter, are on a lot of records back in the day. And so we're going to look at how this particular US original fares against the 45 RPM 2LP Analogue Productions release as part of Atlantic's 75th anniversary. Let's see how it fares. Before going into the actual numbers, I want to remind everybody of the equipment that I use. I have two turntables side by side, RT81 Fluence turntables, and on each of those is an Audio-Technica 540 ML cartridge, the ML standing for the Microline stylus. My phono stage is a Gordon Slee SE2, that's Special Edition 2, and amplification is through the NAD 3140 integrated amplifier. Now, I don't use the phono stage of that, of course. I'm using the Gordon Slee. For my speakers, I have Polk Audio RTA 11T towers, and I do some of my verification and listening on headphones as well, and I use the classic Sony MDR V6 headphones. Now, I run my two turntables side by side, and I play each copy of the record, one in this case the US, and then in the other case the Analogue Productions 2x45, side by side, and I have a switch to go between them. So I time the two 5 to 10 seconds apart of each other so I can hear a section and then click it and hear the same section on the other and back and forth. That's much better than, of course, relying on my memory, which, of course, is fading as I've gotten older. So it's important to recognize that that's the method that I use as opposed to memory. I also have some folks helping me occasionally to come in and will do the switching for me so that I don't really know which record is being played. That's sometimes called blind testing, and that's ideally the best way to really judge it without having a predetermined expectation. So let's look at the numbers. The first area that I always talk about is the quietness of the vinyl. Again, I have a first pressing original US press that was done at PRC Precision in Richmond, Indiana. And for that one, I give it an 8. It had some noise, but it was pretty good, actually. Better than my original Bad Company self-titled. I think I rated that one at 7.5. But the AP was even quieter this time than the one that I did for Bad Company self-titled. It was a 9. This is 9.5. It was even quieter. Not quite dead quiet, but darn close to dead quiet. So definitely advantage to Analogue Productions. When it came to the bass or the bottom end and the gripping side of it to where you actually could feel and experience the bass and feel it going down at a certain level, the reach of that and the grab of that was stronger with the Analogue Productions. And it was distinct enough to where it made a difference. And it made not only a sonic difference, but an impression difference. An impression meaning to me, when I can start to hear the bass guitar more specific, and we'll talk about that when we talk about imaging, when I can hear that more specifically, then I can appreciate that particular instrument and what it's doing. And the bottom end of that was, in fact, better. So again, advantage AP 8.5 on the OG, 9 for the Analogue Productions. Mid was about the same kind of delta in there. The voices were a little bit more distinct and a little more forward in the Analogue Productions. They got lost a little more in the original, I would say. So it definitely had an advantage within the Analogue Productions. Now, when it came to the treble, The treble was very much close in terms of rating it, but I will say they were different in a way. The original tended to have a sharpness to it that was sounded just a tad different than on the AP. The AP, the highs were, I would say, a little smoother. So it really depends how you like that upper sound. So I would call the one on the OG a tad more shrill, but not as a negative, not as a distraction, not as a problem, but definitely somewhat different. But again, they both were very well presented and very strong in their presentation to delineate the treble and the upper ends that were there, especially in things like cymbals and things of that nature. So there was, in fact, very much in my mind, they were very similar when it came to that. But when it came to the imaging and the sound stage, definitely the distinction of the instruments and delineating them, and the ability in the sound stage to see a broader you are there kind of feeling to it and some depth, the Analogue Productions had the advantage. I think sometimes some of these OGs are a little hot in the sense that they come off that way, and some of these reissues can be a little technical, a little clinical, but in this case, it really wasn't one of those, like, let's say, Thriller with the one step, where it was way too clinical. Here, it was just that you could distinguish more, and it was more lifelike. And it didn't get into losing the actual energy and the feeling of the songs. And this was especially true on slower tracks on this record. Now, that is a similar outcome that I had, an experience that I had with the Bad Company self-titled when I compared these. Ironically, both of these had that same characteristics. In other words, the rockin' songs on the record, they sounded really good. They met these numbers and all, but, at the same time, some of the real openness and airiness of the record in terms of hearing it more distinctly became much more pronounced in the slower songs. And I guess that makes sense. A little less going on, a little more echo and reverb, and so it kind of opens things up. But in this case, the opening up was more profound on the Analogue Productions. So in the net of this, when you look at it and you average it out, you end up on a scale of 10 having an 8.5 for the original and a 9.1 for the Analogue Productions. So a fairly decent distinction between the two. Now, one thing I like to do here when I get these numbers is go and say, well, let's take the quiet vinyl aspect out. I think it's really important. It's, to me, one thing that I think some people appreciate to see. But let's say put that on the side, and let's talk about the raw recording and what I hear in that regard. When you take that out, of course, it impacts both of the numbers in a way, and what it does is it removes some of the advantage that the AP had, so it goes from a 9.1 to a 9. And it removes a little disadvantage that the US original had, and it goes from an 8.5 to an 8.6. But still, there's that distinction. And so, a lot of people say, well, what, half a point, how much is that? Well, it's relative to what you're looking for and what you think. But again, I always say it depends, how much do you like this album? If you want to hear the best version of it, then this is what I think it is. The AP presents that to you. Now, of course, if you're averse to the fact that you don't want to get up for 45 RPM cuts and, every 2 songs or whatever it might be, have to get up, then, if you think that kind of difference isn't worth the hassle, so to speak, and maybe not worth the purchase or whatever, if you already have one, I get that as well. So there's nothing here saying that the OGs aren't solid, but the goal here is to try to do better. And in this case, that definitely is what happened. It is very distinguishably better. And so I enjoy that difference, and it brings about a better appreciation for a lot of the songs that are on this record. So those are my findings as it relates to the Bad Company Straight Shooter release from Analogue Productions, the Atlantic 75th series. Another solid representation coming out of Kansas from Chad Kassem and the team. So there you have it, another vinyl shootout. We've got another one coming around the bend with In Excess album Kick. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so by clicking on the bell below in the all option. And a thumbs up or like is appreciated for the algorithm, as are comments or questions. Try to get to them as quick as I can. So until we catch you next time, we want to thank you for being here. Take care, everybody.